Good morning. So, after running into some of the issues previously with the flight not wanting to work quite right, I decided that I would fly the 320 again. A, to test the textures, B, to try and see if the autopilot glitch would happen again. Now, it'll be a little fast as I'm going to keep most of this video going at a higher rate of speed other than the takeoff roll. But the overall textures loaded in much better this time, and I got the pushback to go a little smoother. It still doesn't work quite right, but it is a lot more normal than it otherwise would have been. So, this flight is a short jaunt from Toronto over to Montreal. So it's not a massive long distance flight. And I noticed in doing my setup and configuration for the flight that the game still defaulted me to 39,000 feet, which is above the overall ceiling of this aircraft. So I wish they would kind of fix some of that stuff. So I lowered it down to 36,000 before I kind of realized what my flight distance was. So when I get airborne and get moving, I end up lowering it a little more for two reasons. One, because if there are problems with the autopilot, I don't want to have to be fighting with massive altitude drops to try and get ready for landing and things like that. Now, the texture side of things, as you can see, the buildings out in the distance on my left, they're a little more generic, but they are at least there, whereas last time nothing was properly there, and you could kind of see it when I was taxiing, but there were some actual buildings in the downtown region. At the altitude I was flying at when I got to them, they weren't quite perfect, and I still had some issues with the plane kind of drifting a little bit, but I don't believe that I'd gone in and once again reset my dead zones, so any little movement on the stick was causing some problems. But once I got autopilot kicked on, overall things seemed to work fairly well, and as you can see here, the textures look perfect. So the city looks great. It was kind of fun to see it from this angle. I'd only come into Toronto twice, once on the flight that I'm creating here, where I just was there for my work permit, and then I jaunted back over to Montreal, and the second time for a meeting with the client, and that one was in December, so there was a lot of snow out, and it was quite pretty coming in and seeing downtown and all that when I flew out the next or 2 days later. But you can actually see downtown from this distance. You can see the buildings, the roads, the proper changes between the different sections of the city. So I was much happier with the way everything looked this time through, and I still cannot figure out what happened in the textures. So kind of interesting. The departure route that I chose took me out over the city, which again mirrors my realistic flight, but it was also kind of interesting because it kept me at a lower altitude for longer until I cleared out of the city area. So I thought that was kind of unique and fun. So here I've zoomed in on the city. You can see the tower and the stadium down there. Unfortunately, you can also see that at this altitude the buildings are a little rougher. Some of that's just my settings, but just can't get everything perfect. But if you notice, even at this altitude with the buildings and everything down there, my frame rate overall has been very good thus far in the flight. And that's, again, I'm really hoping that when they do the next update, which is supposed to be the performance release, that it continues on this trend, because right now at this part of the flight I'm cruising along at about 26 to 28 FPS, which is just perfect. I mean, the game's flyable overall at about 18, but it is a heck of a lot nicer when you have more frames in the game. So you can see there my flight plan on the radar is not super far. I don't have a long distance to go. They kept me low for a while, and then they started climbing me up, so I started going higher, and then eventually I slowed my climb down. And right now we're just going to enjoy the scenery for a little bit, and we'll resume in a couple of moments when I get to the descent phase, where I'll talk about a couple other aspects of this flight, because the descent and the approach on this one was actually quite enjoyable. All right, so there is the airport off to the right, the St. Lawrence below me, splitting in the two directions, downtown Montreal farther off to the right, and we are flying parallel to the two runways. Now, I am coming in a little high at the moment. I had a family issue to take care of, so I missed my initial descent, and I really didn't realize how long it was going to take and how fast I was going, but managed to get back fast enough. And what I did was two things. One, I turned off the auto throttles because those always seem to get me in trouble. And basically I set my descent altitude to the one that's necessary, and then I pulled my throttles to essentially idle, which at this altitude and descent rate, well, not descent rate, but basically pulled them down to about 26%. So they don't stop because they're providing power to the rest of the plane and they don't want to shut off. But I pulled them down enough that I got a decent descent rate out of it, and my speed stayed around 190 to 200. You can see I've got it a little lower now because my altitude's farther down. It doesn't need to go quite as fast. So now I'm enjoying the big train depot there just to the right of the airport, and I'm trying to find some of the scenes and areas that I know of. There's downtown in the distance past the mountain. I can't remember what everything is called, and I'm looking for the Orange Julius, which is right across the street from the hotel I stay at, and I was trying to follow the roads to get exactly where it was while trying to fly and do everything else. But this was really a fun flight because it almost perfectly mirrored the approach that I did, and you can see this other airplane coming in. That was kind of fun to watch as he came in on approach. And there's the Orange Julius that I found, and there's the hotel that I've stayed at before, so kind of funny. All right, we just got clearance to go down even farther, and again you can see that thanks to pulling back the throttles, I managed to do the throttle control very manually. And what I really was trying to do differently on this one, because all my other flights either came in way too slow and I didn't have enough lift to kind of keep the plane going, or I came in way too fast and then stalled out and just hit the ground way too hard. So what I wanted to do on this one was properly utilize the flaps, because if you've noticed a lot of my approaches, the plane is still angling down while it's on approach. That's not typically how a plane approaches. I know it sounds a little funky, but for the most part, if you see a plane in profile on their landing approach, the nose is up, because they're using their wings, they've got their flaps fully deployed, and they're just kind of gently gliding down into the ground. And it's basically a controlled fall, to quote Toy Story, falling with style. The way I've been doing it is I've only really been using flaps at level 2 and 3. I did, on that approach back into DFW, get the flaps a lot farther, but the approach just wasn't set up to handle that. So on this one, what I've done is I have already started extending my flaps. I'm at flaps 1, I believe, right now, or very shortly. This far out, I haven't even made my turn yet, and I've already started deploying my flaps, which is a lot more realistic to slow the plane down, to create the lift. And it was also really neat because the slats on the front extend out. I know they do that on a real plane. It was just kind of something I hadn't really noticed in detail on the plane. So it was kind of neat when I caught that and saw, oh wow, those go out too. In doing so, you can see now that the profile of the plane is perfectly level, or more in tune with what it should be in kind of the real world flight. So now I'm coming in even closer. I'm getting down in altitude. I've got my flaps at the 2, and you can see my speed is only 140 knots and going down. That's because I'm really carefully monitoring everything. Now I had some issues getting the autopilot control to go where I wanted it to. And then as I extended the flaps again, I was going a little bit fast, so I kind of got up and I pulled the throttles again to slow down so I could get back on the right track. And that's kind of right here where I'm nosing down, but I'm generating so much lift I'm not actually going down, and then it kind of levels off again. Now the reason I'm doing a lot of this external internal flipping is because I'm trying to look at some of the controls to get used to what I'm seeing, as well as enjoying this scenery, because this is a really fun approach next to the river, downtown, stadium, everything else that's kind of going on in here is really kind of neat and fun. And then you got the airport and the approach, and kind of the hotel I stay at will fly kind of near it, but you can see the nose is now angling back up, which is more natural. I've got flaps at 3, I believe, at this point. So there's really only one more layer of flaps. I'm coming in at a smooth 140 knots. I'm now kicking on the approach systems. I'm not turning on, I don't remember if I turned on full approach just yet, but I got the gear going down now. So everything on this approach is being done a lot better, a lot more timely. I've prepared well in advance to this, and I'm keeping this plane slow. You can see to this point now, the plane is angling up. It's making small minor adjustments as I'm coming in, and I have got my speed nice and done. I just kicked on the approach system, and now you can see the plane is starting to angle down to the runway, and things are going much better. What I noticed at this point, though, was that there seemed to be a bit of an issue with where the plane was flying into. It wasn't actually aiming to the runway. It was aiming to, I guess, the repeaters off to the side, or it wasn't aiming me at the runway. So I noticed that I was going to run into some issues. Now we'll catch in real time as I make the final portions of this approach, which was, again, another really fun thing because I've driven these roads that I'm flying over to get to the airport and things like that. So it's just kind of really interesting. And then the area I'm more familiar with is coming up just off to my left wing. Typically they land over the river, but depending on wind conditions, of course, they can make this nice, cool approach over the city, which I've done twice, and I've been to Montreal, I think, 7-8 times now, and this is the second time I've gotten to do this approach. You can see the orange Julius there off to the side. Kind of cool. I'm checking the profile of the plane for my approach. I'm checking my speed. And what I'm really using on the artificial one there to the left is I'm looking at where it's telling me my stall and my speed warning levels are, because I want to really ride kind of the minimums, which right now I'm trying to hold at about 120 knots, which is pretty slow overall. But you can see the flaps are fully down and I am just putzing in here, which is much, much better than the other flights where I've been coming in super hot. Even at this point, I've been pushing like 180, 200 knots, whereas now you can see there's the profile of the plane. I'm nose up again. I'm gliding in beautifully to the airport, but I'm really concerned that silver bolt just to the control below the front of the plane, about where the mouse was, is pretty much the direction that I'm flying in. And that's what's got me a little concerned. So I just turned off autopilot and took full control because I really wanted to make sure that I was flying at the runway. But I got kind of nervous because the plane immediately started dropping a little faster than I was anticipating, so I was concerned about glide slope. And I really wanted to make more of the approach from inside the plane, but without being in VR, it's kind of hard to gauge the level above the ground. And I really wanted to keep my throttles, everything doing exactly what I knew, and it's so much easier from the external portion of the plane right now. So I kind of overcompensated there on that right lineup, and then you can kind of see I realized I was coming in a bit high, so I dipped forward. I throttled up just a little bit too much. I just got concerned that I was going to fall a little too soon, and then here, once I got over the runway, I kind of pulled the throttles a little too much, and I came down and I couldn't flare it enough, so I didn't really try. If you looked at my rear elevators, I didn't flare it all that much, and then I kind of bounced a little bit. But the bounce was really not that bad. I've been on planes that have come in a little harder than this one. So overall, I'm not dead center, but I'm on the runway. I did bounce, but it was an acceptable bounce that would be a decent landing. Not a great landing, but a decent landing. And I've been on planes that have kind of bounced on the runway like that, more than once sometimes. So I think this is the first proper 100% semi-realistic approach and landing that I've actually pulled off in this plane. So I was really kind of pleased with how this went, and it was a lot of fun being able to kind of keep an eye on my speeds, my flaps, my approach. Everything seemed to come together really well on this one. What I didn't allow to run was the auto throttles. I gauged it all manually by looking at the controls within the airplane that kind of give me that hint of, am I accelerating, am I decelerating? Is my speed against flap level good, essentially, to create too much lift, too little lift? Am I riding the minimums? That display is an absolute lifesaver, because without that, I would not be as adept at modulating my throttle to kind of ride those minimums and bring me smoothly into the airport here. And that's really the best part of this, because it wasn't perfect, but that was super fun. The longer approach, coming in nice and slow. The DFW approach that I did previously coming in from Costa Rica was my favorite. It was a decent approach, but I fumbled the landing. But this one, oh man, we had maneuvers, we had more manual control, we had a lot more activity going on, and it was just wonderful to have everything kind of work properly and come together, and I was able to do what I needed to do to properly fly the plane into the airport. So that was a lot of fun, and I really am pleased with this one. Now, the return parts of this journey will take us through Chicago before we go back to Dallas. And there's not necessarily this flight, but there's another flight that I had where, due to crappy weather in Chicago, I was a couple hours late out of Montreal, and I missed well, not missed. My flight was canceled out of Chicago to Dallas, unfortunately. I got to Chicago when I was supposed to be getting to Dallas. This unfortunately has happened multiple times. And so this particular flight, I ended up finding a flight that was leaving very soon that was connecting me to Houston. So I flew to Houston, sat in their airport for 6-7 hours. I got there at 1 in the morning, and the next plane left at 6 or 7 in the morning to go from Houston to Dallas. That one kind of sucked. The other one, I waited in Chicago for 4 hours, and then I got back to Dallas, but that was fine. That was just a snowstorm. So anyway, we'll see what we do next. Hope you enjoyed this approach. I think it was actually my best one yet, and this plane is an absolute pleasure to fly when everything works. So thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.